Stocks, bonds, ETFs, straight out of downtown Chicago. This is Zacks Market Edge.
Welcome to Zacks Market Edge, the podcast about investing in your life. I'm joined this week by Ben Rains, Zacks stock strategist, who is also the editor of the Marijuana Innovator newsletter, but also is the new editor of Zacks' latest new newsletter, the Alternative Energy Innovator. Zacks hasn't launched a new newsletter in a little bit of time now. It was actually in February 2021, it looks like. We've been Skyping or looking over the old portfolios here to see when was the last time we launched one. And that was Headline Trader. And before that, we launched Commodity Innovators right when COVID was starting, also around the same time period, February 2020. And I want to say that Jeremy Mullen might have been like the last person I had on this podcast on a new newsletter launch, like in Zacks offices. So that's how long ago that was. So it's kind of rare to get a new newsletter launch. And I'm excited. I always cover them all here on the Market Edge podcast, because usually when we launch something new and it's covering a certain area, something interesting and exciting is going on in that area. Obviously, we had the commodities 2 years ago. That turned out to be a good bet. And headlines, well, that's always just kind of the headlines. But now alternative energy, Ben, that seems super intriguing. What does that mean? What does alternative energy actually mean?
Well, thanks for having me, Tracy. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be launching this new service. So yeah, alternative energy is the name we landed on because people kind of think alternative energy, there's green, there's renewable, there's lots of different catchphrases. So alternative energy was kind of a way to get lots of different areas of this non-fossil fuel energy ecosystem that's going to be driving kind of growth in the next decade and for hopefully the next century and beyond. I mean, that might sound a little hyperbolic, but I think we really are kind of the cusp of the next energy revolution. I mean, fossil fuels for the last 150 plus years have created this dynamic, explosive economy that we know today that's created riches that really people couldn't imagine 200 years ago. And I do think that we're now on a cusp of just something has to change. We're still, fossil fuels are still going to play a really large role in the economy in both the US and beyond for years and years and decades to come. But with that, alternative energy is still going to be like the growth area in the energy space. And we've seen over the last 2 years just how important energy markets are and how fragile they can be. So investment is going to be huge, and it already has been massive. So we're going to be talking about hydroelectric, solar, wind, nuclear, next-gen nuclear, battery technology, hydrogen fuel cells, carbon capture, rare earth miners, lithium, stuff like that. Really just kind of stuff that might even sound like science fiction down the road. So we're really, there's stuff that's already established, like the hydroelectrics of the world and wind and solar, but then in nuclear as well. But there's lots of growth in all those different areas, because even though solar has become so popular so fast, it's still a really microscopic portion of energy generation in the US and beyond. So we're getting at a good point where there's lots of money behind it, US government incentives, Wall Street investment, incentives around the rich world, and really even oil-producing nations like the United Arab Emirates are spending billions of dollars on renewable energy technology because they see the winds changing as well. So I think we're really just at a great time to be starting this service.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Because that's all I see with a lot of companies these days is, where are they going with, like, they always use the term renewables and like those kinds of phrases. And so I think it's on everybody's lips right now. So yeah, that's why I'm excited about this newsletter and excited to see what you're going to put in it. Now, I have to do full disclosure. I have no idea what Ben is putting in this thing. How many stocks are you going to have in it? Do we know?
The general goal is to get to about 15 to 20 stocks in the portfolio at any one time, and we're going to slowly start our way there. The first trades are going to be out next Monday, the 14th of November, and then kind of just build up. So we're not just going to instantly start with 15 to 20 stocks or anything like that, but we're slowly going to add. And I have a laundry list of at this point over like 100 companies that are in my portfolio world of opportunities. So yeah, lots of different realms we can dive into.
Now, will that include all types of market cap sizes, I'm assuming?
Yeah,
it's not
there's
just
really
going to be like large, or it's going to be
No, there's going to be nothing off limits. I mean, we kind of wanted to make it as broad based as possible, so there was nothing we couldn't touch. We're going to have large caps, mid cap, small cap, recent IPOs, kind of anything in between as well.
Okay. And international, I take it too.
Yeah. As I said, we talked with a lot of different people before we started the service, and we decided on having there's no boundaries when we want to set for ourselves in terms of alternative energy.
Okay, cool. And for all of you listening, I know I've mentioned many of our newsletters over the years on the show. And if you want to check it out and you can take a 30-day trial. It's only $1. You can go sign up. So I'm going to give you the link right now of where you can go to sign up. It's pretty easy to remember, but it is Zacks, ZACKS.com/ultimate, ULTIMATE. So it's Zacks, ZACKS.com/ultimate, ULTIMATE. And if you're listening to this podcast, 6 months, a year later, it's 2023, you are interested in alternative energy and you were listening in, you can still use that link. You can go there at any time and do the 30-day trial. It's $1. You can check out all our newsletters there, including mine. I have Insider Trader and the Value Investor portfolios over there. Those are kind of hot right now too. But this one, if you want to check out alternative energy, you can go do it through that at any time. So remember, it's Zacks.com/ultimate. Okay, so with that being done, I've asked you already, what does alternative energy mean? Because I am kind of confused. When I was preparing for this podcast, I'm looking around, I keep seeing renewables, and I'm like, is renewable alternative? But then I determined, yes, it was, because that's like solar and all of that. Where do things I don't know, like where would you focus on if you were trying to invest for the future in these companies? I mean, I bring that up because I was telling you about the portfolios that we created here at Zacks in 2008, I think it was, right before the Obama and McCain election. So we had to create portfolios, one for John McCain and one for Barack Obama, that you'd want to invest in depending on who won. And with McCain, we went for the energy stocks. He had a driller in there, and some big defense stocks that would be like Republican focus. And then on Obama's side, we had some solar stocks because it was just starting to be like the renewables and things were coming into focus back then. But the one that I picked for back then is no longer around. It's like not even trading. It's actually interesting to see those two portfolios. I should do a whole podcast on those portfolios, because about half the stocks, and there were only like 6 in each one, and half of them no longer are traded, and it's only 14 years later. So that's also interesting unto itself. But that one did have a solar one. It's not trading. And I've been in those solar stocks every couple of years, it seems like. And then I just did a value investor podcast, and I had Jinko Solar on that podcast, JKS. It is Chinese. It's from China. And but it had the good Zacks rank. It was cheap. And it had double-digit earnings growth expected this year and next year, which I was surprised about. I'm like, oh, double-digit earnings growth. But where does like solar fit into all this stuff? I mean, people have been burned for years thinking that was the place to be. And it's never really turned out to be that great of a trade.
Yeah, I mean, as we said, we've talked about solar for a really long time. I mean, that was the Obama-McCain election was a long time ago, especially when you're considering it. Companies that don't even exist anymore were going to be the big plays if one of those candidates won. Yeah. And I would say that solar has been a thing for a really long time. It's been in the consciousness for a really long time. But in
Right.
terms of actual like electricity generation and the capabilities of these solar panels, uh, it hasn't really even popped up in kind of until the mid 2010s. And even the last 5 years is really when you saw this real boom in solar panels and kind of high level stuff that's attached to the grid that's not just on top of someone's roof. And the prices have gone down precipitously. So now we're kind of at the cusp where people, before it was just sort of like a rich person's hobby. If you wanted to be environmentally conscious, you could get these really, really expensive solar panels, put them on your roof. And also the efficiency was really bad back then. In the last
Okay.
10 years, the efficiency has gone up like crazy. And we're still only at a fraction of what they think these solar panels could get to. So solar is certainly going to play a huge, huge role going forward. And as I said, it's the last decade has seen a lot of growth. I mean, renewable energy accounted for about 10% of U.S. electricity generation in 2010. It's at 20% now, and that doesn't even include nuclear. So if you include kind of the broad non-fossil fuels, we're at 40% of electricity generation, and that's still only a small amount of actual energy use. So we've gone a long way really quickly, but we have a really long way to go. I mean, we expect, or reports suggest that renewables going to account for about 40% by 2050, with a huge amount of that growth coming from solar and some of it at wind as well. But solar is really just coming into its own. It's been in its infancy for a long time, but the technology's come pretty far pretty quickly, with China playing a big role. I mean, they've spent lots of money in these factories, and they've just been churning out solar panels like crazy. Obviously, there's some political stuff going on with that, but they've just actually having a bunch of them goes a long way in getting the cost down, because nothing's ever going to be efficient when you're just getting it off the ground and you're not making many of them. But we've come a long way really fast, and I think we still have a really long way to go as well, which is why there is so much long-term growth we're on way.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, maybe it's just my bias of like Jinko Solar, I think has been publicly traded since 2006. So by like 2008, it had only been around like 2 years as a public company. And now it's many years later and things might have changed, but my view of it kind of has stayed the same because I was burned in the early years.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
now it's the later years now.
well, yeah, and it's still hardly even the later years when you consider that. I mean, in terms of uh, actual, so the electricity generation mix, you could just use this as like a simple example of things. Solar is still only about 3% in the entire United States, so it's still like a tiny, tiny microscopic industry. And yet some of these companies in the last couple of years, a company that I'm considering adding, I'm not going to name it at the moment, but for instance, their revenue was about 300 million. And this is a company who makes inverter technology, which is a key component of these solar panels that they help, they convert the various power systems. So it's not it's not as easy as just the solar panels, which there's so many of them. So these inverter companies do really well. They did 300 million in revenue in 2018. They did 1.4 billion last year, and they're projected to do 3 billion in 2023. So
Wow.
it's happening really fast, and these are the kind of growth figures that you're seeing for a lot of these companies in the solar industry and other areas of the renewable landscape. That it's We've been talking about it for a long time, but now the money is actually flowing, and it's not just government incentives. They've pushed things forward, but now Wall Street and private companies are really investing. It's not hyperbolic to say trillions of dollars are being invested in solar and other various alternative and renewable energy investments.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. I definitely will be tuning in to your newsletter to figure out which company that one is, because I'm always on the lookout for that kind of growth going on in whatever sector it is, because that's exciting. And I can see now why it's under the innovator portfolio here at Zacks, and not just like one of the trading services or investor services, but it is in the innovation area. What you were just mentioning that company, which sounds like it's one of the component type of companies. Where do some of those fit in just in the world of alternative energy investing? Because I own a couple of lithium companies in my portfolios right now. I own Albemarle, ticker ALB, in the insider trader. We bought that in February, and I think that's in one of our other portfolios too. It's in one of the other ones. And I also own SQM. I'm not going to say what the actual name is, but that's the ticker, and everybody just kind of calls it SQM because it's Chilean.
Yeah, right.
I can never say it, and everyone who listens to this podcast knows I mangle the names. So I'm just calling it SQM for my own self, and I own that in Value Investor. And I did buy some for my own personal portfolio. They're both lithium producers. SQM is in Chile, and they're one of the largest ones. But the lithium goes into the batteries. The batteries that go into electric vehicles, you have to use lithium in that. Obviously, the lithium goes into many other types of batteries too, into your smartphone and these other things. And they're trying to get lithium into some like airplanes, but it weighs too much, so that's probably not going to work. But where does like a company like this, because I wouldn't normally think of these types of companies as alternative energy really, but it is, because their component is allowing, some things to happen in alternative energy, I guess, if that's
they're certainly going to play a role. I mean, I think you and I actually spoke a couple weeks ago just about how in Chile there's now kind of a political wrangling to figure out what they're going to do with their huge lithium reserves and their lithium mines there. And it is certainly going to play a really large role in the broader space, and definitely a role in the portfolio as well, because all of these various components are going into, as you said, the battery technology, which is going to play a huge role as well, because one of the big criticisms you hear about solar panels and solar power is that the sun's not always shining. What do we do? And that has been a big problem. But now a lot of these solar panel companies, and if you get solar panels put in your house today, like a modern new one in 2022, you're going to get solar panels put up, and then they're also going to have like a battery storage reserve on your house as well. So you're not just wasting the power because you're not using all of the power throughout the day. So kind of the next big, huge revolution is going to be the companies who can continue to store all of this solar energy, because the sun is so powerful. And that's why there's all this hope that it can kind of be this never-ending source of energy, but we just haven't been able to kind of literally harness it all because we can't use it all as quickly as it's there. So these battery storage companies are going to be a huge role in the portfolio, in the space going forward, and obviously these lithium miners are going to be a small component of that as well.
Yeah. Now, I was looking around at some of the other chemical companies, because Albemarle and SQM are listed in the chemical category on Zacks.com, because there really is no renewables or alternative energy category as like an industry. And I saw like DuPont, which is ticker DD. They've been around for forever, and they're in a whole bunch of areas, but they reported earnings this morning on November 8th, 2022, and it was better than expected. Apparently they're doing some kind of huge buyback, but I noticed that Albemarle, SQM were both up big today, as well as DuPont, and there was no news on the other ones, so I'm thinking, something went on with DuPont that they're pushing up these other ones. But then I was wondering, like, well, does DuPont have anything that's alternative energy? They've been around forever. I'm like on their website looking around. I'm like reading their earnings report going, is there something in there? But isn't that kind of a problem for you, because you're running this newsletter, but even for any investor who wants to be in alternative energy, because some of these companies might be alternative energy in some way, like because, they do produce lithium, or they're doing whatever other thing, some component that's going into the windmills or something that you wouldn't otherwise know because they're listed under, I don't know, some other industrial area. And so how does an investor find good alternative energies? I mean, the solars are like kind of obvious. We know Jinko Solar, that is one. But how do you find out that SQM is an alternative energy play?
Well, you have to sign up for the service.
Well, yeah, right. Obviously, I know you're going to give us some, but it just tells you kind of like the difficulty of it in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I think you speak to a problem, but also an opportunity in the space, that there are so many different companies who maybe have been doing something different, or what they were doing is no longer kind of in vogue, and they see an opportunity to kind of propel themselves forward with, say, renewable energy technology or alternative energy technology by supplying a component or a mineral or something like that. So you do, and this is kind of be a jumping off point to talk about that fossil fuel companies are not going to be kind of the boogeyman of this portfolio. We're not going to say they can't be touched, because these companies know that that's the future as well. And it's not just tokenism when they decide they're going to invest billions and billions and billions of their own money into renewable energy technology. So it's anyone who sees kind of the tides shifting towards a like an alternative energy future. And it does make it difficult. I mean, searching for those 100 stocks I currently have as my like broad base of where I'm going to be able to pull from going forward, like right away, it was not easy. And I think that's a hard thing for the average investor. They don't want to take hours and hours of their time to kind of piece through what company's doing what and where can the growth be for these alternative energy sectors. And as you said, it is such a new space that half these companies aren't even listed on, like, Zacks.com doesn't even have like a whatever specific areas necessarily. There's the solar area, but going forward, maybe we can change things, and you'll be able to know kind of off the top of your head what companies are in an industry that services the larger renewable / alternative energy universe.
Yeah. Okay. So you did just mention you're not keeping it, the fossil fuels out of the portfolio necessarily, because I'm thinking of someone like BP. They've announced several years ago that they're going to push forward big into the renewables. So someone like them could possibly be in contention to be in it.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, I'm not just going to flood the portfolio with just a bunch of oil and energy stocks, which would have been great for the last year. But it also, we can't just discount it because some people have certain feelings about these companies, because they are actively investing in these areas. And you could say it's for political wrangling or something like that. But it really is also that they want to have a viable business. They don't want to be the company you talked about in the solar industry that's no longer trading because it doesn't exist. Right. And I'm not saying that's the near future for any of these companies, but if you're a good executive, you have to be thinking about where a BP or an Exxon is in 100 years from now, not 10 years from now. So those companies will certainly be a possibility to add to the portfolio because they are investing in stuff like carbon capture and different biofuels and hydrogen fuel cell technology. So just all the money that's going into it is how you're going to get the progress. And when these big publicly traded companies are investing their own capital, it's going to go a long way, because the government spending can only do so much, and they've spurred kind of this initial push. And now I think the ball is really only rolling downhill, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be any stopping it, no matter who's in power in Washington or who's in power in Europe, even in China. I mean, the ball is just rolling, and Asian countries are involved as well. So there's no off limits, as I said, kind of at the top. But I didn't mention fossil fuel specifically. Any companies who are actively investing in the space will be a possibility. But as I said, it's not just going to be 10 fossil fuel companies in the portfolio at all times.
Yeah, I should hope not, especially after hearing about some of these solar-ish type areas in solar that are growing as fast as what you just mentioned a minute ago.
Yeah, for sure. No, we want to be looking for the companies with massive near-term and long-term growth potential. So
yeah. Now, before this podcast, I was sending you some notes about what areas I was thinking about covering. And I did mention some of the fossil fuels because everyone on this podcast knows I follow that area pretty closely. And I did hear a week or two ago when Pioneer Natural Resources, ticker PXD, reported their earnings. They did mention some renewable projects in there, but I just kind of glossed over that because I was like, oh, okay, that's nice. But I went back to go look at it now for this podcast, and they are doing two renewable projects. Those are providing power to the company's Permian Basin business and the Texas electric grid, apparently. And it's some big solar project that they're participating in that's down in Texas. But they're also working with Next Era Energy, which is ticker NEE. They're based in Florida. For developing a wind generation facility on their land in Midland, Texas, there that will be operational in 2024. But when I looked at all that, I was like, no, these are the type of things you would not be investing in, because this is like they're doing stuff to help themselves. They're not like, I mean, it's good. I'm glad they're doing a wind generation facility on their own land. That's awesome. But this isn't like they're trying to innovate, or I don't know. This sounds like you would not be interested in, putting a company like Pioneer into the portfolio based on what they're doing right now.
I mean, I'd have to dive a little deeper into what Pioneer's plans are, but I mean, it sounds like something where they're gonna maybe get some in the good graces of some tax incentives or something, and put some wind turbines on their land to power digging for more fossil fuels, which I mean, it's better than I guess better than nothing. But I mean, that's a specific case. I don't know too much about specifically, but speaking of like general in Texas and just places with lots of space, that is where you're going to see a lot of these wind and solar projects, because one of the drawbacks to wind and solar is you do need a lot of space. So those are the areas, which is why offshore wind is going to be a big thing. Maybe you'll see these floating solar panels in the ocean or lakes. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that seems like it's in a sci-fi movie, but it is stuff that's not only an idea, it's actively happening now. So once we get the real we're in such an early stage that some of these things are not necessarily economical at this point. I mean, they're viable in the sense that these projects are there, these offshore wind and some of these big, huge solar farms. But the real reason why there's a lot of companies in this industry is because it's a huge challenge. But with these challenges does come like great opportunity. I know that sounds really simplistic, but the fact that these wind farms and solar panel areas are really far away from where huge population centers are is a problem, but also, as I said, like a big opportunity for the companies that can solve those issues.
Yeah. Okay. We didn't talk about nuclear yet. Let's just briefly cover that area. I guess we can't really do it briefly, but everybody says nuclear is the area that could be the place that we need to be for the future of energy. And is there any way to invest in it now, or is that all coming in the future?
So there are some ways. As I said, I'm not going to get into any individual stocks. There are some ways to get into the nuclear energy space, but it has been such kind of a forgotten area, even though nuclear does play a pretty large role. It's about 20% of U.S. electricity generation mix at the moment. The state I live in and the state you live in, Illinois, gets, I think, about half of its electricity from nuclear. So, but a lot of the problem with it and why some people are very skeptical is obviously for some of the issues that have happened with like Fukushima and things like that. But also, we just haven't been investing in new technology. I mean, some of these nuclear plants have been around for 40 years. So I think the push kind of seeing what's happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and kind of more countries wanting to become energy independent, have this where we don't have to rely on the whims of whoever's in power in X country to supply us natural gas or oil, being able to have these modern kind of next generation nuclear reactors. You have companies who are actively starting that tech in the United States, places out west that are trying to build these kind of small scale nuclear reactors as well, which are going to be more kind of self-contained. And there's just kind of endless potential in nuclear, in the sense that nuclear itself also has endless potential. I mean, you can invest in uranium companies at the moment, but kind of the holy grail we actually spoke about right before we started recording was the idea of nuclear fusion, which is the opposite of what we do now for nuclear energy, which is fission, which is splitting these heavy atoms like uranium. So we want to get to the point where, and this is something where there are lots and lots of companies trying to do this right now. This is kind of like the holy grail of energy, would be to create a nuclear fusion reactor. It's the same process that powers the sun. So those companies are not necessarily public yet, but I could easily see a lot of them going public, kind of just to take on more public money to make these huge bets, which they are making now. So as I said, yeah, nuclear is kind of fallen by the wayside. A lot of people don't think about it, or if they think about it, they kind of have bad thoughts come into their head. But if I encourage anyone to dig a little deeper, it's certainly going to play a much bigger role. And I think a lot of governments, including the U.S., are going to start to invest more heavily in at least redoing the plants we have, and then also investing in these smaller modern technologies. Because as I said, it's been around for over 50 years.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that sounds really interesting as well. I feel like a lot of these companies could be the future unicorns that are out there. You know, how like some social media companies and all that were the unicorns, or Uber, Airbnb were the unicorns from the last decade. And now maybe some alternative energy companies will be the new stock unicorns for the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could be the case. I mean, when you think about how without reliable, affordable energy, nothing we do in the economy is possible. And I think that people take it for granted, especially if you live in the United States or other really wealthy nations, that when you're going to turn on your computer, or when you're going to turn on your lights, the power is going to be there. And it's just something you can take for granted. So the companies that are going to be at the cutting edge of this next wave of power generation and energy generation, they certainly could be these unicorns you're talking about, these upstarts and these pre-revenue companies that could be on the cusp of creating something like a nuclear fusion reactor or some technology we can't even really fathom at the moment. And I know that sounds like a joke, but it really is true. You never know what's going to be around the corner.
Right. All I know is every time I talk to someone about this, the only thing that pops in my head, and this is going to be really lame, but is I think it's the Star Trek Next Generation movie where they go back down to Earth when the guy who's going to invent the warp drive is like in trouble or something, and they have to go make sure he invents the warp drive. But he's just some like, you know, regular dude out in the countryside, like who's experimenting with this technology. But that technology in the Star Trek universe changed the humankind, because that warp drive technology allowed them to basically go see the world, you know, the galaxies, because it allowed them to leave Earth, easily leave Earth. So it always just reminds me of that movie. So good job, Star Trek writers, for like putting it out there that, you know, it's only takes this one breakthrough. And
I mean,
then
it really is true. I mean, and you bring up an example of Star Trek. But I mean, in recent modern human history, I mean, people didn't think we were going to be able to fly. People didn't think we were going to be able to split the atom until right before it happened. So you never know. And all the people who say, oh, that's a pipe dream or that can't happen, can be proven wrong almost instantaneously.
Right. Good point. Okay, so this sounds like it's always been an interesting area, and now I eagerly await to see what you put in this portfolio, and where these companies go in the next couple of years, and who becomes the Steve Jobs or Elon Musk of alternative energy. There will be someone out there who takes the reins and comes through with that breakthrough, and there'll be unicorn companies. So this is exciting. And remember, if you want to check out the newsletter, no matter when you're listening to this podcast, you can do so at zacks.com/ultimate is the link. It's always good, and always you can use it at any time. And you can definitely go in there, do a 30-day trial. It costs $1 to do the 30-day trial. You can see all of our newsletters, and we have a bunch, including mine, the Insider Trader and the Value Investor. But Alternative Investor or Innovators, Alternative Energy Innovators, is now launching. So be sure to check that one out for sure. And let me recap the stock tickers we talked about in this episode. And again, I have no idea what's going to be in Ben's. They never tell us these things. I always have to tune in just like everybody else when he launches it and puts some stock picks in there. So these are just ones I decided to talk about today. And some of the fossil fuels we mentioned were BP, because they are doing a bigger push for renewables. Pioneer Natural Resources, you can go read about what they're doing. I own that one in my own personal portfolio. PXD is the ticker, but they're in the partnership with Next Era Energy. That's a good name, right? They're a public utility in Florida, but that's a good name there. NEE is the ticker. And then some of the lithium plays were Albemarle, ALB is the ticker. SQM is the Chilean one, and it's just SQM. And that's one I also own in my own personal portfolio. And then I mentioned Jinko Solar because that was cheap with the double-digit earnings growth expected, JKS. And then I also mentioned DuPont just because I thought maybe something might be going on there, but you'd have to dig around in there because they're such a big company and they have numerous divisions. Who knows? But a lot of these kind of component companies and chemical companies may have a play in alternative energy depending on where it goes. And that ticker is DD. So as always, be sure to subscribe because who knows what we're going to be talking about next week on the Market Edge. But it should be interesting because there's a lot going on right now in both the economy and the stock market. So we're going to be covering it all. And you can get it on Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify, of course, on SoundCloud, also on Amazon Music. But be sure to get us somewhere. And I'll see you again next week with some more stocks.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.